Good morning.
Good morning.
All right, so before we get started talking about the poem, I do just kind of want to know how this went for you. How confused were you by this?
Very.
Okay, kind of. Okay, you said some of you are saying very. Jonathan, you say kind of. Why were you only kind of confused by it?
I got some of the metaphors because there was a lot of metaphors in it. And
Yeah.
I didn't understand if you meant like literally or figuratively, so to speak.
Okay. Yeah. Anything that you guys found particularly confusing here? And we'll get back to those metaphors in a second. Were you able to notice any sort of shape or pattern to this?
At the end of daybreak.
Yeah. At the end of daybreak repeats here a lot. Yes, good. So that it seems to be organized around the repetition of that phrase, right? Anything else you notice about the pattern of this, the way it's shaped? Anything that seems to run through the whole thing?
Kind of like a journal or something.
Okay, what made you think it seemed like a journal, James?
He was just like, well, first of all, the daybreak thing kind of makes it think. So you're going like by day, and then he tells like different accounts. Like it doesn't really flow as like a story.
Yeah, it does. You're right. Yeah, it doesn't flow like a narrative, right? There's no plot here, and indeed, it's not. It's not a story. It's a poem. It's a long poem. So yeah, there is no real narrative thrust. But there are a couple of things that the author is sort of going for here that he's trying to structure these musings around, right? It's not just a sort of random chaotic assemblage of thoughts and images. Anything else you noticed here that looked like it might have, be some sort of pattern?
Repetition.
Okay, a repetition of what, Jonathan?
Like simple words like death, white. He also used madness. He repeated that a couple of times.
Okay, yeah. Death, white, black, madness. Yeah, there is a good deal of repetition. He comes back to the same words and ideas frequently. And I think we can maybe connect this as well to this repetition, this frequent repetition of this phrase at the end of daybreak. Right? So a little bit about the situation that Cesaire is describing here. Cesaire was born and raised on the Caribbean island of Martinique, which is actually still a French colony. Right? Martinique is one of those places that, when the various European powers sort of went and made their empires, Martinique is one of those places that hasn't been cut loose. Right? Most of, say, French holdings in North America, in Africa, various in the Middle East, various other parts of the world, Indochina, right? Those have become independent nations. Martinique has not. So the repetition of this phrase at the end of daybreak, the repetition of so many of these negative ideas, right? This refers to a kind of rut that he feels his native place is stuck in. At the end of daybreak, right? At the beginning of every day, right? When the sun comes up, it's always the same, right? Not even same shit, different day, right? Same shit, same day. Right, so he's describing a society in which time doesn't seem to be progressing. At least certainly not in any sort of forward movements. At the end of daybreak, right? It's always at the end of daybreak. Now, if we look at the title of this, right, Notebook of a Return to the Native Land, What does the title itself suggest about his current relationship to the native land?
He wants it to go back to how it originally was.
Well, I'm not sure that's quite what he would, how he would frame this either. If we think about the islands of the Caribbean, right? What has become of the native population of the Caribbean islands? The people who were there first.
They were enslaved.
Well, they were, and that didn't work out so well, right?
Yeah.
And now they're dead. By and large, the native peoples of the Caribbean are extinct. Right? Remember those, those tribes that Columbus encountered, right? The Carib and the Taino. Yeah, they're gone. There are no more. Everyone who lives in the Caribbean is to some extent now what's called a Creole. Now, we may remember this term from earlier in the course, right, when we talked about Orinoco and a lot of Equiano, right? Does anybody remember what a Creole is, what Creole means?
A mix.
Yeah, it's a kind of hybrid identity, right? So in the contemporary Caribbean, most people have some mix of European, African, and often Indian ancestry, East Indian ancestry. All right, most people have these kinds of hybridized identities. Now, these identities themselves are dependent upon that movement of the triangular slave trade that we talked about earlier. Yeah, Ashley, go ahead.
Okay, and this isn't really that class, but I kind of noticed that your thingy is zoomed in super far.
Oh, all right. Well, let's
Just thought you
fix
wanted
that. Thank you. Is that fixed?
Yeah, it's better.
Okay.
Because I can see like the pores on your face.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. That's weird.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. You don't want. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. You don't want that. All right. So back to this idea of hybrid identities. So can one really return then from Cesaire's vantage point to this idealized Martinique that's like it was in the past?
No.
No. Yeah, that's gone. That's irretrievable. That doesn't mean that what he's doing isn't in some way backward-looking and forward-looking at the same time. We'll get to that in a minute. But let's get again to this title, right? The Notebook of a Return to the Native Land. What does that suggest about where he has been in relation to his native land?
In France.
Yeah, he's been elsewhere. Yeah, and he's coming back. And Cesaire spent most of the 1930s, right, from 1931 to 1939, as a student in Paris. If you were an exceptionally good student in the colonies, and this tended to apply whether you were in a British colony or a French colony or some other colony, your reward when you got to the end of your schooling was that you would get to go then to this the mother country, and you would get to study there. Probably first at some sort of advanced high school to bring you up to speed, because you are, after all, only an ignorant colonial. And then you might get to study at the university. So for a student like Cesaire coming to France in 1931, right, initially what this looks like is, okay, they're going to let me become French. Right? They're going to let me assimilate now into French society. I can take my place in French society. Right? I've had this French education. I'm going to complete my French education, and then I'm going to be one of them. And then he gets to France, and this is not what happens. Right? He's still does exceptionally well within the French system, right? He earns a master's degree, actually writing a thesis on Black American writers and the way they describe the South. But he's never going to get a job in the French university system or the French schooling system. They're going to send him back to Martinique to teach high school. So the whole time he's in France, he is reminded that he's not like they are, that he is always going to be an other. Have any of you ever heard this particular term, alterity? Is this a word that you're familiar with? It's okay if you're not. I don't necessarily expect that you will be. Okay, so alterity is a term that we often use when we're talking about colonial literatures or minority literatures, right? Alterity is the state of being the other in a pair. Right, so if we're talking about a situation of alterity, right, we're not talking about a situation where there are multiple identities to choose from. Right? There are two identities, and if you are experiencing alterity, you are always in that sort of that other, that subordinate identity. Make sense? We get it? Okay. So this is the situation for the colonial coming to study in France, right? There were certain subjects you were barred from studying if you were a colonial. To give you an example, there was a writer by the name of Albert Memmi. Memmi was a Tunisian Jew who, Tunisia was at the time a French colony. He comes to study at the university in Paris, and he wants to study philosophy. Now, we don't, in American culture, for whatever reason, hold philosophy in very high regard. We force our philosophers mostly to work as baristas. But in France, philosophy is held as sort of like the be-all, end-all of academic study, right? Philosophy is the most important subject. In Europe, philosophers have their own television shows and are international celebrities. So do with that what you will. Anywho, Memmi comes to Paris and is told that he is not allowed to study philosophy because he is a colonial. So he studies psychology instead. But that subject, or that thing that's considered the crown jewel of the French educational system, is barred to him because of his status as an other. And alterity tends to lump all others together into the same category. So, you know, if the norm in a society is, right, in order to be French, right, you would have to be, at that time, white and Catholic. If you're anything else, right, if you're black, if you're Jewish, Asian, any other identity, right, then you are in that category of other. And this was sort of brought home to Cesaire immediately when he got to France in 1931. There was a colonial exposition in Paris that year. And I mean, this was a common sort of thing that the great imperial powers of the 19th and early 20th centuries did, right? They would gather together people and products from all of their colonies into one place in the capital city, right? And sort of show it off. Like, how many of you have ever heard of like I don't think we do these things anymore. Have you ever heard of like a World's Fair?
Yeah.
Okay. In a World's Fair kind of situation, each independent country is presenting things more or less on an equal level, right? They have their own little pavilions, or maybe an example you might be more familiar with. How many have ever been to Epcot Center at Disney World? Anybody?
It's been a while since I went to Disney World.
Okay. There is at Epcot Center a place called World Showcase, right? And each little country, and we have here a setup in which Norway is adjacent to Mexico, so obeys no laws of geography that are known to man. Each little country has, a restaurant and a couple of souvenir shops, and maybe a ride, perhaps a film. That's kind of what World's Fairs looked like. It's certainly what these colonial expositions would have looked like, right? Each different colony maybe has a table at which to present their wares and their, peculiar cultural practices to the French nation to then sort of be consumed by them, right? It's like, oh, isn't this interesting? But what this does, right, then sort of lumps everybody together into this single identity of colonial, right? Whether you're from Martinique or Senegal or Vietnam, you're all colonials in this one building exhibiting your wares together. And this is the thing that struck Cesaire when he got to Paris. So he met other black students in Paris who were going through similar crises of identity, right? In particular, he became friendly with a young man from Senegal by the name of Léopold Sédar Senghor. And Cesaire and Senghor together wrote for a journal that they published called L'Étudiant Noir, which in French translates to the black student. And in 1935, this is something actually, if you read the textbook introduction, this is something your textbook actually has wrong. In 1935, in the pages of L'Étudiant Noir, Cesaire coins the term negritude, which translates simply to blackness. And Cesaire's idea of negritude is opposed to the assimilationist ideal that he's been fed for most of his life, right? Growing up in a French schooling system, having France and education in France being held out to him as the great big prize, right? So negritude is anti-rational, for one thing. What a writer in the negritude movement looks at when they see the European Enlightenment, when they think about people like Descartes, they think about people like Immanuel Kant, David Hume, right? These great European thinkers. What they see is, right, these are people who did nothing to stop that triangular slave trade that was going on at the same time they were writing, right? So their celebration of reason, these negritude writers come to associate with complicity in the slave trade. Right? It was reasonable and logical economically to continue to do this. So the negritude writers adopt a sort of anti-rationality, which actually sort of fits really well into a surrealist artistic mode. They also tend towards a philosophy called Pan-Africanism. Is this a term that any of you have ever heard? Pan-Africanism. Okay. This is a philosophy that was promoted in particular in the early 20th century by a Jamaican by the name of Marcus Garvey.
Oh,
Okay, you know about Marcus Garvey?
Kind of.
Okay, what do you know about Marcus Garvey?
From what I understand, he basically wanted everybody to like go back to Africa and reclaim like their African roots.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jonathan.
He was Jamaican. He was one of the national heroes.
Uh-huh.
He was a lawyer, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And he lived in New York for a while.
Yeah, in New York and in London. Yep. Moved around rather a lot. Political radicals tend to do that. Things get a little hot for you one place, you go someplace else. But yeah, Garvey's philosophy was that people in the African diaspora, right, people of African descent living outside of Africa, needed to reconnect with their specifically African roots and with specifically African culture. Now, the criticism that's leveled at Pan-Africanism and at negritude as a movement frequently is that it's what's called a kind of essentialist movement. Now, I think we've mentioned essentialism before in class. If the term sounds familiar to you, does anybody know what it means? Remember what it means? Okay, it comes out of anthropology. All right, an essentialist anthropologist believes that all human cultures are more alike than they are different. And so what they do is look for points of connection between cultures, and they emphasize points of connection between cultures. Now, a Pan-Africanist is essentialist in a more specific sort of way, right? There's an assumption that all African cultures are more alike than they are different, and that what they should be what people should be reconnecting with is some sort of essence of Africanism that can be accessed by anyone of African descent. Now, one thing we have to remember about Garvey and about other Pan-African thinkers, by and large, they've grown up in a colonial structure where they've been subject to alterity, right? So they've been essentialized by the dominant culture that regards them as more or less all the same. And so they're kind of taking and embracing that sameness. Right? It's like, okay, yes, we are the same in that we are different from you. And so what the negritude movement seeks to do is emphasize those differences and to kind of generalize them across a colonial black population. Make sense? Everybody still with me? Okay, good. So, let's try to get into the poem a little bit and see where these ideas manifest. So, it might help if we just kind of start at the beginning and try to work our way through a little bit. So if you look on page 602, right, our first repetition of the line, "At the end of daybreak." "Beat it," I said to him, "you cop, you lousy pig, beat it. I detest the flunkies of order and the cockchafers of hope. Beat it, evil Gree-Gree, you bedbug of a petty monk." Then I turned toward paradise as lost for him and his kin, calmer than the face of a woman telling lies, and there, rocked by the flux of a never-exhausted thought, I nourished the wind. I unlaced the monsters and heard rise from the other side of disaster a river of turtle doves and savannah clover, which I carry forever in my depths. Height deep against as the 20th floor of the most arrogant houses, and as a guard against the putrefying force of crepuscular surroundings, surveyed night and day by a cursed venereal sun. So what do we start with here after the first at the end of daybreak? At the end of daybreak, right, the sun comes up in the morning, and what's the first thing you encounter?
Aggression?
Why would you say aggression?
Well, I mean...
Who's being aggressive? Go ahead.
Césaire, I think.
Okay, who is he being aggressive towards? Who's the speaker being aggressive? Yeah, a cop, right? Why a cop? Why does he start with a beat it, you lousy cop?
He's mad because he's a guy of like the system and society.
Yeah, the cop is a representative of that distant, uncaring colonial authority, right? And colonial police were usually selected from among the population of the place, right? So these policemen would not have been Frenchmen who came to Martinique. They would have been other Martinicians who were then given some authority over other people by the French, right? So we give you a uniform, we give you a badge, and you're going to enforce our rules, you're going to enforce our laws. This was a common colonial strategy, right? You set some of the colonized population up above the community, up above other people, and they will treat each other much more cruelly than we would treat them. So, right, we start with a cop, a monk, right? So a representative, sort of legal, political authority, and a representative of religious authority. And when we start getting to the landscape here, what's it look like? Why does he call his surroundings crepuscular?
Because it's crescent shape.
Okay. Putrefying force of crepuscular surroundings, surveyed night and day by a cursed venereal sun. Well, what does venereal mean?
Disease.
That's the word we usually follow that up with, right? What's a venereal disease?
STI.
Yeah, exactly. It's a disease that's sexually transmitted, right? So the venereal sun is a sexual sun, right? The sexual part is the important part here. But also that there is this disease everywhere, right? These putrefying force of crepuscular surroundings, right? At the end of daybreak, burgeoning with frail coves, the hungry Antilles, the Antilles pitted with smallpox, the Antilles dynamited by alcohol, stranded in the mud of this bay, in the dust of this town, sinisterly stranded. So the Antilles are the island chain that Martinique is a part of. What is he representing them here as? Like, what's the metaphor that he's using here? What do the islands make up?
Diseases.
They're stricken by diseases, right? They're stricken by smallpox. They're stricken by alcoholism. But what sorts of things can suffer smallpox or alcoholism? What do you have to have in order to get sick?
Germs.
Germs. And what do the germs invade?
Bodies?
A body, yeah, exactly. We have the island chain here metaphorized as a body. And it's a sick body. It's a diseased body. And this sort of gets at that difference between the prose passages at the beginning and the verse that he gets into later. What does he describe? What part of the island is he describing in the prose passages, at least at first? What part of the island is he talking about at the beginning of the poem?
Shore?
It's not the shore, no. The beginning of the poem is about the town, right? The main town on Martinique. It's called Fort-de-France. The verse passages of the poem primarily deal with the countryside, right? These morns, these hills that he goes out to, he looks over. A morn is a sort of characteristically Martinician hill. It's a local term. So, if we look at these binaries around which the poem is organized, right? Town, country, health and disease, white and black, urban, rural, right? This gives us maybe some sense of what he's trying to construct here, what he's trying to put together. Right, at the end of daybreak, the extreme, deceptive, desolate bedsore on the wound of the waters, the martyrs who do not bear witness, the flowers of blood that fade and scatter in the empty wind like the screeches of babbling parrots, an aged life mendaciously smiling, its lips opened by vacated agonies, an aged poverty rotting under the sun silently, an aged silence bursting with tepid pustules, the awful futility of our raison d'etre. Now, what's significant about the parrots as an image here? What's special or interesting about parrots? They can talk, yeah, they can talk back, right? So what do you mean by they can talk back?
They can mimic stuff they hear.
Yes, good. Parrots are mimics. They mimic speech. You say things to them, and they will say them back to you. Right? Like how many of you have seen that? I think it's like one of those stupid Geico commercials, right? Where there's the pirate who's just taken the ship, and he's got the parrot on his shoulder that is repeating all the things he said in private, and is getting his crew to turn on him. Yeah, all parrots do is repeat. They don't generate language. So what he's painting here, right, is the situation of the colonized person, right? That as it is, right, our little town here, little Fort-de-France, right, this is a mimicry of our colonial overlords in France, right? All we're doing is repeating the things they tell us. All we're doing is what they say we should be doing. And much of the first part of the poem is concerned with these acts of mimicry, right? The cops and the monks, the parrots, right? Our social structures, our educational system, our urban landscape, all of this is just repeating back to France what France tells us. Now, why are there so many references here to rum and sugar?
It's why they were colonized for. I mean, probably what they were colonized for.
Yeah, I mean, what's the primary export crop? The primary economic basis of most of the Caribbean islands is sugarcane, yeah. And there's a long history of French engagement with this sugar trade, right? Let's think back again to Candide, right? Do you remember Candide's conversation with the maimed slave? Anybody? Okay. Do you remember what the last thing the slave says to Candide is before he goes off crying? Before Candide goes off crying, the slave can't go anywhere because his leg's been cut off.
He's waiting for his master to come back.
That's part of the conversation, right? The master's coming back eventually. He tells Candide, right, this is the price of the sugar you eat in Europe. Right? In order for you to have your luxuries, other people have to suffer. And what Cesaire is drawing attention to is the fact that even, in 1939, when he's first writing this poem, the situation hasn't really changed all that much, right? Are the people of Martinique growing this sugar or distilling this rum for themselves?
No.
Yeah, it's for export. They're making this stuff for someone else, right? They're still doing it. This is why this place was colonized in the first place. And they're still doing it mostly for export. There was a good example of this sort of thing. I saw a short film not too long ago. It was a documentary filmmaker who was talking to farmers in Africa. And the filmmaker was talking to some farmers who grow cocoa beans. And, they said, like, look, the farmers are like, I don't, a white guy comes and buys these from me every harvest season. Right? I have no idea what they do with them. But, they'll pay for them, so I grow them and I sell them. Go ahead.
That kind of sounds similar to a documentary I actually saw about people in rural China who actually go to the iPhone factories and make the iPhones, and someone who was making the documentary handed him his iPhone, and he turned it on and he was so amazed because he's never seen one.
Right, he'd never actually seen one actually assembled,
and
right?
He said it was like magic, and it was so sad because he lost his fingers making them.
Well, and and this is again when we think of one of the big intellectual influences of the late 19th, early 20th centuries, right? This Marxist idea of alienation from your work, right? You only see a part of what it is you do, right? Colonial, Marx is talking about factory work, right? It's like, okay, so you make an iPhone, right? You only see the parts that you work on. You never actually see the finished product. So you have no real connection to what it is you do or what it is you're making. Now, colonialism actually kind of encodes that into agriculture as well. You've got people who are growing products they don't use themselves for people who are going to assemble them into something that they're not going to taste. Right? The chocolate bars, the fancy rum drinks are not going to come back to Martinique. They're raising these crops for other people. They're producing these things for other people. Right? People who have sort of long had this sort of relationship of dominance over them. Now, he also talks here about this town sprawled flat, toppled from its common sense, inert, winded under its geometric weight of an eternally renewed cross, indocile to its fate, mute, vexed no matter what, incapable of growing with the juice of this earth, self-conscious, clipped, reduced in breach of fauna and flora. Now, the weight of the cross here that he talks about. Writers in the Negritude movement also tended to regard Christianity as a foreign importation that had been imposed on them. Now, we can compare this to a lot of Equiano, right? If we think back to Equiano, now, Equiano was a convert, right? He converted to Methodism, was a preacher for a while. And how did Equiano tend to use Christian rhetoric? He used it to argue against slavery, right? But he was sort of arguing in the language of the oppressor about their hypocrisy, right? It's like, you claim to have these ideals, I share these ideals, and yet, you would treat me as property. So he's subverting that discourse by operating within it. Someone like Cesaire is just trying to overturn that discourse altogether, right? I reject your ways, I reject your religion. I reject everything that you have tried to impose on me. I reject the reason you have tried to impose on me. I reject the religion you have tried to impose on me, right? Everything you have done to make me feel like an other. Everything you have done to make me feel like I don't belong in your society. So what does he seem to want to replace all of this with? Is this an entirely negative vision? Is this entirely a, middle finger, to the friendly, France, you suck. Leave us the hell alone. Go away. Is there any positive way forward that he points to here? Let's look on page 621. I want to look first at a passage here of rejection. Right? And these tadpoles hatched in me by my prodigious ancestry, those who invented neither powder nor compass, those who could harness neither steam nor electricity, those who explored neither the seas nor the sky, but who know in its most minute corners the land of suffering, those who have known voyages only through uprootings, those who have been lulled to sleep by so much kneeling, those whom they domesticated and Christianized, those whom they inoculated with degeneracy, tom-toms of empty hands, inane tom-toms of resounding sores, burlesque tom-toms of tabetic treason. So, what is he proud of his ancestors for not doing? Those who invented neither powder nor compass, those who could harness neither steam nor electricity, those who explored neither the seas nor the sky.
They didn't colonize and subjugate other people.
Yeah, they didn't colonize and subjugate other people, right? And what was it that the European powers used to do that? Powder, compass, steam, electricity.
Technology.
Exactly, yes. They used their technological expertise to go and subjugate others, right? That's the argument he's making here. And he's saying, my ancestors did not do this. But they know the most minute corners, the land of suffering. Those who've known voyages only through uprootings, right? Involuntary voyages, right? Not voyages of exploration. So he's rejecting another set of Western accomplishments here, right? He's rejecting technological advancement as a positive good, as a positive goal. Tepid dawn of ancestral heat and fears overboard with alien riches, overboard with my genuine falsehoods, but what strange pride suddenly illuminates me? Let the hummingbird come, let the sparrowhawk come, the breach in the horizon, the cynocephalus, let the lotus bearer of the world come, the pearly upheaval of dolphins, cracking the shell of the sea, let a plunge of islands come, let it come from the disappearing days of dead flesh in the quicklime of birds of prey. Let the ovaries of the water come where the future stirs its testicles. Let the wolves come who feed in the untamed openings of the body at the hour when my moon and your sun meet at the ecliptic inn. So, what's coming together here now? Now that he's pushed away all of this Western technology. What's he then trying to bring together? When he talks about the quicklime and the birds of prey, for example, let it come from the disappearing of days of dead flesh in the quicklime of birds of prey. He's referring to a process of carrion eating, right? All of this dead weight of history that's collected, right? Let the birds of prey devour it. Let the birds of prey destroy it. And then, let the ovaries of the water come where the future stirs its testicles, right? What kind of image is this?
Sexual.
Yeah, it's a sexual image, right? So, you know, is it just gratuitous? Right? Let's just talk about ovaries and balls.
It looks kind of like let's come together and make something new.
Yeah, it's a procreative image, right? The hour when my moon and your sun meet at the ecliptic end, right? So he is talking about the conception of the birth of something new and different. Under the reserve of my uvula there is a wallow of boars. Under the gray stone of the day there are your eyes, which are a shimmering conglomerate of coccinella. In the glance of disorder there is a swallow of mint and broom which melts always to be reborn in the tidal wave of your light. Calm and lull, O my voice, the child who does not know that the map of spring is always to be drawn again. The tall grass will sway the gentle, the ship of hope for the cattle. The long, alcoholic sweep of the swell. The stars with the bezels, if their rings never in sight, will cut the pipes of the glass organ of evening zinnias. Corianthus will then pour into the rich extremity of my fatigue. And you, star, please from your luminous foundation, draw Lemurian being of man's unfathomable sperm yet undared form, carried like an oar in woman's trembling belly. So he's marrying here images of conception with images of spring, right? So this isn't just birth, this is rebirth, right? Coming back after a winter, after a desolation. Right, what's the holiday that he refers to in the first part of the poem in the prose section? What holiday is being celebrated?
I guess Kwanzaa.
It's not Kwanzaa. But it's usually celebrated around the same time of year.
Easter?
Yeah, he's talking about Christmas, right? And Christmas occurs in the winter, you know, to the extent that Martinique, in its tropical climate, has a winter. Although I did discover, you know, that Georgia actually has a winter, which surprised me, coming from Pennsylvania. It's not quite the same thing, but yeah. So Christmas occurs in the winter, and as a representative, like it represents to him not only, okay, we're in the dead of winter, but that it's the weight of that foreign tradition being pressed down on him, right? So here we're coming out into the spring and into a new birth that is based on a kind of reconnection with older forces, with earth forces, with natural forces. So instead of shouting hallelujahs in a corrugated iron church, right now he is sort of envisioning himself sort of mating with the earth itself, right? And producing something new out of it. Now, I think I also want to look here, as I think this is relevant to the project that he's undertaking here, the passage we've just described. I want to look on page 629. And first off, I do want to apologize to anybody who is offended if I read this out loud, right? To anybody who is going to be offended if I read out loud the N-word, right? It's just, it's part of the poem, and Cesaire is using it to make a particular point, right? You know, as beardy, white, socialist, liberal guy, I often feel a little bit uncomfortable with this kind of rhetoric, with this kind of language, but, you know, you all trust that I'm not trying to harm anyone, right? That I'm not trying to, okay. All right, so that out of the way, right? Page 628 at the bottom, right? And there is the nigger pimp, the nigger ascari, and all the zebras shaking themselves in various ways to get rid of their stripes in a dew of fresh milk. And in the midst of all that I say, right on, my grandfather dies, I say right on, the old negritude progressively cadavers itself. So, first, the image of the zebra trying to get rid of its stripes, right? He's talking here about this process of colonial assimilation that he's accusing the grandfather he refers to of being guilty of, right? The zebra tried to get rid of his stripes, right? The zebra tried to get rid of the parts of him that are black. The zebra tried to be white. No question about it, he was a good nigger. The whites say he was a good nigger, a really good nigger. Massa's good old darky, I say right on. He was a good nigger indeed. Poverty had wounded his chest and back, and they had stuffed into his poor brain that a fatality impossible to trap weighed on him, that he had no control over his own fate, that an evil lord had for all eternity inscribed, "Thou shalt not," in his pelvic constitution, that he must be a good nigger, must sincerely believe in his worthlessness without any perverse curiosity to check out the fatidic hieroglyphs. He was a very good nigger, and it never occurred to him that he could hoe, burrow, cut anything else, really, than the insipid cane. He was a very good nigger. So what are they using that word? Why is Cesaire using this particular word to describe this sort of imaginary grandfather, this past generation? What is he using it to mean?
Probably like a person contouring to what? I don't know.
It's kind of a callback. I feel like he's trying to speak from the place of the slave master.
Okay.
And he's being ironic about it.
Okay. Explain. If you can.
When he says it like that, it always has this twinge of, yes, he was a very good, and word I'm not going to say it. He was a very good for being beaten and forced to work and forced to do that. He was very good indeed, and it has this sarcastic, bitey edge to it.
Yeah, I mean, he's using the word because it's a slur, right? It's a slur that's been directed at people like him to disempower them. And someone who is good from that vantage point is someone who continues to participate in his own disempowering, right? Who continues to absorb the ideology of the slave master, right? So we talked a little bit when we discussed those modernist manifestos, right? Again, about this idea of ideology. This is another place where Marxist ideas are creeping into the writing of the negritude movements, right? This idea that you absorb the ideas and values of the dominant culture and then just sort of replicate them without thinking about them. It just sort of ends up in your blood somehow, and you just keep doing what the dominant culture tells you to do, believing what the dominant culture tells you to believe. And what the dominant culture is telling this imaginary grandfather to believe about himself is that he is less than, right? Is that he is inferior, and that he's only good for cutting sugarcane. That's it. And they threw the stones at him, bits of scrap iron, broken bottles, but neither these stones, nor this scrap iron, nor these bottles, O peaceful years of God on this terraqueous clod. And the whip argued with the bombilation of the flies over the sugary dew of our sores. I say right on, the old negritude progressively cadavers itself, the horizon breaks, recoils and expands, and through the shredding of clouds, the flashing of a sign, the slave ship cracks everywhere, its belly convulses and resounds, the ghastly tapeworm of its cargo gnaws the fetid guts of the strange suckling of the sea. And neither the joy of sails filled like a pocket stuffed with doubloons, nor the tricks played on the dangerous stupidity of the frigates of order prevent it from hearing the threat of its intestinal rumblings. So where is the danger from the slave to the slave ship, or the slave trade represented here as a slave ship? The colonial enterprise, where is it coming from? Where's the danger to the colonial enterprise coming from?
The belly of the ship.
The belly of the ship, from within, right? The ship ignores its own, it's so busy making money, like piling up doubloons, that it's ignoring the rumblings within it. In vain to ignore them, the captain hangs the biggest loudmouth nigger from the main yard, or throws him into the sea, or feeds him to his mastiffs. Reeking of fried onions, the nigger scum discovers the bitter taste of freedom in its spilled blood, and the nigger scum is on its feet. The seated nigger scum unexpectedly standing in the hold, standing in the cabins, standing on deck, standing in the wind, standing under the sun, standing in the blood, standing and free. Standing and no longer a poor madwoman in her maritime freedom and destitution gyrating in perfect drift, and there she is, most unexpectedly standing. Standing in the rigging, standing at the tiller, standing at the compass, standing at the map, standing under the stars, standing and free, and the lustral ship fearfully advances on the crumbling water. So what has he just depicted happening here?
The slave revolt.
Yeah, exactly. This is a revolt. This is a revolt. The slaves within the ship come up on decks and take over the ship, right? The punishment of that one loudmouth who wouldn't behave himself inspires the others to come up on deck and take it over. So do we notice what word disappears from the second half of this passage about the revolt?
The slur.
Yeah, the slur word is gone now once they're in charge of the ship, once they have taken the ship over. Right? The slur word is that symbol of oppression and domination. And there's no need for it once they've got the ship. And now our ignominious plops are rotting away. By the clanking noon sea, by the burgeoning midnight sun, listen, sparrowhawk who holds the keys to the Orient, by the disarmed day, by the stony spurt of the rain. Listen, dogfish that watches over the Occident. Listen, white dog of the north, black serpent of the south, that cinches the sky girdle. There remains one sea to cross, oh, still one sea to cross, that I may invent my lungs, that the prince may hold his tongue, that the queen may lay me, still one old man to murder, one madman to deliver, that my soul may shine, bark, 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 and the owl, my beautiful inquisitive angel, may hoot. The master of laughter, the master of ominous silence, the master of hope and despair, the master of laziness, master of the dance, it is I, and for this reason, Lord, the frail-necked men receive and perceive the deadly triangular calm. So, the reference here to madness, to barking, to dance, right? This is all celebration of the irrational. Celebration of these impulses that reasonable civilized people keep tamped down. And this is one of the places where Cesaire is in closest contact with surrealism, right? Do we remember from a couple of sessions ago what it was the surrealists were trying to do in art? What source they were trying to draw their inspiration from?
Dreams.
From dreams. And what were dreams manifestations of for them? What are they trying to get underneath or get into?
The human psyche?
Specifically the subconscious parts of it, right? The parts of it that we're not really aware of, the parts of it that we keep tamped down. Right? They're trying to tap into the psychic energy of the unconscious by sort of putting together these fantasy images. Right, these sort of weird combinations of things that don't quite seem to go together, and yet often still make a kind of, is it possible to make an irrational kind of sense? Maybe, maybe not. To give you an example of this here, when he talks about his parents' marriage bed, if I can find this, right, page 607. At the end of daybreak, beyond my father, my mother, the shack chapped with blisters, like a peach tree afflicted with curl, and the thin and patched pieces with pieces of gasoline cans, which create swamps of rust in the stinking sordid gray straw pulp. And when the wind whistles, these odds and ends make a noise bizarre, first like the crackling of frying, then like a brand dropped into water, the smoke of its twigs flying up, and the bed of boards from which my race arose, my whole entire race from this bed of boards, with its kerosene case paws, as if it had elephantiasis, that bed, and its kid skin and its dry banana leaves and its rags yearning for a mattress, my grandmother's bed. Above the bed, in a jar full of oil, a dim light in whose flames dances like a fat cockroach. On the jar in gold letters, merci. Thank you. So, the way he describes this bed, right, it's a pile of rags held up on kerosene cans, so it looks like the legs of the bed have elephantiasis. Do you know what elephantiasis is? Anybody ever seen?
It's when your leg swells up really.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's the result of an infection, right? Your legs swell up and it becomes very difficult to walk, right? So the bed itself is represented as having this disorder, right? These swelled legs that make movement difficult, right? It's a representation of stasis. Now, what else seems noteworthy about this bed on which he says, generations of his family have been conceived? What is it missing? What does it lack?
Sheet.
Pardon?
Sheets, pillow.
Okay, well, there's a pile of rags.
True.
Right? What usually makes what's the most important part of a bed?
Mattress?
The mattress, yeah. That's the part you actually lay yourself out on, right? This bed doesn't have a mattress. It's just a pile of rags. Right? No mattress. No real support for those who lie upon it. So he's talking about generations of his family being conceived on this stiff thing. No future, no forward movement. Nothing to support you, nothing to hold you up. Now we juxtapose this with the images at the end of the poem, after the slave revolt. Rally to my side, my dances, you bad nigger dances, the car-can cracker dance, the prison break dance, the it is beautiful, good, and legitimate to be a nigger dance. Rally to my side, my dances, and let the sun bounce on the racket of my hands. Page 631. But no, the unequal sun is not enough for me. Coil wind around my new growth, light on my cadenced fingers. To you I surrender my conscience and its fleshy rhythm. To you I surrender the fire in which my weakness smolders. To you I surrender the chain gang. To you the swamps. To you the non-tourist of the triangular circuit. Devour wind. To you I surrender my abrupt words. Devour and encoil yourself. And self-encoiling, embrace me with a more ample shudder. Embrace me unto furious us. Embrace us. But after having drawn from us blood, drawn by our own blood, embrace. My purity mingles only with yours. So that embrace like a field of even philagos at dusk our multicolored purities and bind me without remorse. Bind me with your vast arms to the luminous clay. Bind my black vibration to the very navel of the world. Bind me, bitter brotherhood. Then, strangling me with your lasso of stars, rise, dove, rise, rise, rise. I follow you who are imprinted on my ancestral white cornea. Rise, sky liquor, and the great black hole where a moon ago I wanted to drown it is there. I will now fish the malevolent tongue of the night in its motionless veneration. Now, one major change we see here at the end of the poem. What was this phrase that repeated through the whole early part of the poem that began almost every little passage? Through the beginning part of the poem? At the end of daybreak. Do we see a change here, temporally? When are we now? Dusk, yeah. So this never-ending day this constant day that's always the same and never changes, is now giving over into dusk and into night, right? Night, which is here represented as a positive value. The sunlight giving way into darkness. But this darkness is good. This darkness is positive. This darkness is creative. Anything else you notice is particularly telling in this last portion of the poem? What is he asking the earth to do to him? What is he asking his native soil to do to him?
Bind him to it.
Yeah, hold me down to you, right? Embrace me, embrace us. So is his vision an individual or singular vision?
Singular?
Individual or singular, meaning what?
Is it an individual vision? Is he only talking about the earth binding himself down? Is it embrace us, right? This is a communal vision at the end of this. Right, it's an anti-individualist vision. It's not every man for himself, not every woman for herself. Everyone together. Everyone bound to this soil. Everyone in touch with this place, with the earth. As opposed to the profit-making enterprises that he has decried in earlier parts of the poem. Right, so there's a definite change here after the slave revolt, right? In his attitude towards the place and the people in it. Right? Once this happens, once they take charge of the ship, they're all in it together. Everybody's in it together, acting for the common good, acting for the good of this place. So the return to the native place is something that doesn't really happen until the end of the poem, right? It's only at the end of the poem that he really bonds with, joins with his native place again. At the beginning of the poem, it seems almost more like it's sort of alien to him. So one of the reasons I wanted you to read this particular poem, right, we've looked at several different uses of modernist literary techniques here, and several different, modernist texts of several different sorts of origins, right? We looked at European modernism, which sort of took that sense of post-war alienation and post-war hopelessness and turned it into a more sort of abstract art. Right? When we looked at Chinese modernism, we were looking at a culture that was members of a culture who were consciously trying to westernize, to Europeanize their culture, their society. Right? Here, we have modernist techniques actually devised in France, used as an argument against colonialism and against European domination. Right? So it's a kind of it's a sort of modernism in the service of a nationalism. So I wanted you to see the different directions in which these movements could tend. And that modernism, global modernism, is a really kind of varied and many-headed sort of thing. Okay, does anybody have any questions about it? I know that this is a difficult poem. It's a difficult poem to understand. It's a difficult poem emotionally for some people. Does anybody have any questions about it at all? No? Nothing? We're good? All right, well, we're going to be looking next time at a story about West Africa written by the descendants of West Africans, of English settlers there. So let me just quickly call up the reading questions, which of course I didn't have the good sense to do before class. I also have something to return to you if you just sit tight for a minute. Are we coming to life? There we go.